are some souls born with a kind of double vision, one eye fixed on the furrowed earth, the other on something unseen, just beyond the blue of the lark's flight. John Clare was such a soul. He entered the world on the 13th of July 1793, in the thatched shadow of Helpston, a small village then cradled in Northamptonshire's rural heart, where lanes wandered like old thoughts and every hedge seemed to whisper stories. Today Helpston sits within the Peterborough Unitary District, but in spirit and soil it remains Clare's, and Clare remains its. His father, Parker Clare, worked the fields and trapped rats for extra coin. His mother, Anne Stimpson, was a washerwoman, known more for her quiet warmth than her literacy, though she sang, and in her voice Clare first learned rhythm. Their cottage was bare, no library, no luxury, but outside the world was alive with poems waiting to be found. Clare's education came not from books, but from hedgerows, brooks and birdsong. He memorized the wildflowers before the alphabet, learned the dialect of rooks and wind chats before Latin declinations. At 12, he attended the school in Glinton Church Vestry when his family could afford it, but the true curriculum was the Fenland sky. By 10, he knew every wildflower by name, every birdsong by heart, and every old path that wound past oak and elder. But knowledge wasn't enough. Clare was a collector of moments, and he began to write them down with whatever he could find. Chalk on slate, pencil on seed packets, ink on sugar paper, he wrote the countryside before it vanished, and it was vanishing. The Enclosure Acts passed steadily through Parliament were claiming the commons, cutting the land into neat boxes, fencing off centuries-old rights of way. Clare watched as hawthorn hedges were torn up, woodlands felled, and ancient paths lost under plough. The fields of his childhood, wide as dreams, became no trespassing signs and blank stares. Where once he wandered freely with whistle and verse, he now stood before padlocked gates, the great green patchwork of memory slowly unravelled, and so his poems deepened. I found the poems in the fields, he wrote, and only wrote them down. These were not ornaments, they were acts of preservation, rural elegies written in rhythm and root. He wrote of hares startled into flight, of skylarks swallowed by cloud, of wind moving like thought through barley. He worked as a pot washer at the Bluebell pub, as a lime burner in Pickworth, and a gardener at Burley House. His hands blistered and ink-stained, he earned pennies, slept cold, but carried whole meadows in his chest. He would hum verses while hauling sacks, composing lines among furrows. Labour was a necessity, poetry, survival. The world called him a peasant poet when London finally noticed years later, a novelty, as if a ploughman couldn't dream. But Clare was no quaint country curiosity. He was a seer, barefoot and bright-eyed, writing not to impress, but to remember. And this chapter, this long mourning of his life, is where the truest Clare can still be found, before madness, before fame, before the fences, just a boy in the meadows, a lark overhead, and a notebook full of sky. Poetry for John Clare was never meant for drawing rooms. It came raw from the hedgerow like bark, like birdsong, like the crunch of frost under a boot heel. It was felt, not fashioned, and yet in his early 20s, those verses scribbled on seed packets and folded leaves began to travel beyond Helpston's fields. Carrying a modest bundle of poems, Clare made his way to Stamford, a market town where the ink still smelled of iron. There his words caught the eye of Edward Drury, a bookseller moved by their honesty and depth. Drury passed the manuscripts on to John Taylor, a London publisher who had once championed Keats. Taylor sensed something unpolished but profound In 1820, Clare's first collection, Poems Descriptive of Rural Life and Scenery, was published. To everyone's surprise, except perhaps the birds, it became a quiet success, selling around 3,000 copies in its first year. For a fleeting moment, Clare stepped into the spotlight. He met Charles Lamb, was granted a modest annuity by the Marquess of Exeter, and became known as the Northamptonshire Peasant Poet. But London misunderstood him. He was dressed in stiff city clothes, paraded through parlours like a speaking relic. They applauded his natural talent, but few grasped the depth of his vision. He missed the mud. Back in Northamptonshire, his world was shifting, and not for the better. The Enclosure Acts advanced, turning once communal fields into neat private lots. Old footpaths vanished, hedges were uprooted. The wild whispering places of Clare's childhood were being consumed by geometry. He responded the only way he could. He wrote. His poem, The Lament of Sordie Well, gave voice not only to himself but the land itself, dispossessed, trampled, pleading. His prose work, The Woodman, startled publishers with its clarity and command, so much so that some doubted he had written it himself. But Clare did not write to impress, he wrote to preserve. He used the language of his people, not snail, but pooty, not ladybird, but lady cow, not thrush, but throstle. Editors tried to tidy him up, to smooth his dialect into standard English. He called grammar a tyrant, and said editors clip the wings of a bird so it sings more politely. He also became a collector of folk songs, copying down melodies and lyrics by ear, preserving a countryside not just of image but of sound. In this way he was not only a poet but an archivist of a vanishing world. But the world had moved on. The very voice that had made him famous, unfiltered, local, rural, was now seen as outdated. His finances deteriorated. He suffered illness. The critics turned their gaze elsewhere. The land was fenced. The language was corrected. The boy who once roamed freely now found himself caged on every side, and within him something began to break. He wandered longer, slept less, became haunted by visions of the past, especially of Mary Joyce, the childhood sweetheart he could never forget. He believed she was still alive, still waiting for him, but she wasn't. She had married another. So he walked through dreams that no longer matched the world. The fences, it seemed, had crept inward. Yet still he wrote, verse as breadcrumbs, poems as lanterns in the dark, a man trying to find his way home, long after the home had disappeared. To the world beyond Helpston, John Clare was fading, once a fashionable peasant poet, now adrift. But within him storms gathered. Reality, once rooted in soil and birdsong, began to unravel like an old path overgrown. The fences had moved inwards. By the mid-1830s, Clare's poetry had grown more disjointed. Memories bled into fantasies. He saw shadows where none stood. The fields he'd once walked were still there, but he could no longer find them. His mind turned backwards, obsessively, to Mary Joyce, his childhood sweetheart. Though she had long since married and died, Clare believed they were still destined to be wed. In 1837, after worsening delusions and deep melancholia, Clare was admitted to High Beach Asylum in Epping Forest, under the care of Dr. Matthew Allen, a progressive physician known for rejecting restraints and encouraging fresh air, writing and self-expression. Fellow patient Alfred Tennyson, not yet famous, was there around the same time. Whether they met is uncertain, but the forest hummed with unspoken poetry. And Clare wrote, feverishly, beautifully, but also differently. His verses became dreamlike, dense with hallucination and identity blur. At times he claimed to be Shakespeare, Lord Byron, Robert Burns or Admiral Nelson. not impersonating them, but becoming them, the self dissolved. He rewrote Childe Harold and Don Juan, recast Robinson Crusoe, and even drafted his own Gospel of St. John. The written word became a mirror, fractured yet still reflecting. And then, one morning in July 1841, John Clare vanished. He walked out of the asylum, barefoot and half-starved, convinced he was going to reunite with Mary Joyce and marry her. With no coat and only a crust of bread in his pocket, he walked 80 miles across a changed England. He slept in hedgerows, foraged wild herbs and ate grass, spoke to strangers in rhyme. His epic walk was both pilgrimage and collapse, part physical feat, part mystical dislocation. When he arrived back in Northamptonshire, gaunt and exhausted, he didn't recognise his wife, Patty. He believed she was someone else, and Mary Joyce was still waiting. He wrote about it in The Journey Out of Essex, half poem, half delusion, where time slips sideways and the lanes blur into legend. He was committed again, this time to the Northampton General Lunatic Asylum, where he would remain for the rest of his life. But this wasn't an end. It was another gate, another field, another path, vanishing into verse. The door at Northampton closed softly behind him in 1841, but Clare did not stop walking, not in spirit. Though his body remained behind stone and ivy walls, his mind wandered still, across lost meadows, through vanished lanes, into pockets of memory untouched by time. He would spend the final 23 years of his life in the Northampton General Lunatic Asylum, but even here, perhaps especially here, he wrote. By now the world had mostly forgotten him. His name no longer echoed in London salons. No new collections were printed, yet Clare filled page after page, verses written in borrowed ink, on the backs of envelopes, in margins of newspapers. Over 3,500 manuscript pages survive from these years. The poetry of his later life was fragmented, lyrical and strangely clear, as though the fog of illness gave way to sudden shafts of brilliance. He returned again and again to familiar images, larks bursting into sky, foxgloves nodding in wind, the glint of a ploughshare in morning light, a lane that disappears around a bend, never to return. He still believed Mary Joyce was his wife. He still claimed to be Byron at times. But through the confusion, his lines carried that unmistakable Clare cadence, earthy and unfiltered, as if dug up with bare hands. The asylum grounds gave him gardens, trees, glimpses of sky. He would often walk them in silence, lips moving with unspoken rhyme. He corresponded with no one, save occasional notes to former patrons. He lived in a room looking out towards the town spire and sometimes towards fields that in his mind were still open. The medical notes described his condition as hopeless insanity, but to read the poems is to feel something else, not hopelessness, but longing and moments of strange peace. He still noticed the slant of rain on gravel. He still listened to the crows. His most famous poem from this time, I Am, bears the weight of both loss and transcendence. I am, yet what I am, none cares or knows. My friends forsake me like a memory lost. I long for scenes where man hath never trod, a place where woman never smiled or wept, there to abide with my Creator, God, and sleep as in childhood sweetly slept. There's defiance in these lines, but also surrender. A man who knew the boundaries had closed in, but found within them an interior field where larks still sang. He wrote his final poem in 1864, the year of his death. He was buried in his native Helpston, in a plot just yards from the house where he was born. The people of the village carried his coffin, and larks flew overhead, whether imagined or real. The fences never broke him. He simply walked around them, in ink, in silence, in dream. In his final years, before asylum doors closed for good, there was a time when John Clare could be found sitting quietly beneath the stone portico of All Saints' Church in Northampton, in an alcove. A solitary figure, cap placed on the ground, writing poems for passers-by, not for praise, not for posterity, but for coins, for ale, for warmth. A man reduced in status perhaps, but never in soul. He would bow his head as if in prayer, composing love poems or memorial verses for strangers, writing them carefully while the wind stirred the edges. Sometimes they dropped a copper into the cap, sometimes they simply watched. But then Clare would disappear back into the streets, his mind still echoing with the rustle of birch leaves and forgotten songs. It was as far as he was allowed to walk. And yet for Clare, the journey was never over. He kept moving, not across land now, but through language, through memory, through the shifting veil of time. Historically, he was misunderstood. Labelled the Peasant Poet, he was often treated as a rural curiosity, a kind of literary scarecrow, propped up for polite society to marvel at. Critics praised his natural talent while smoothing out his dialect, taming his grammar and correcting his unorthodox punctuation. Few realised he wasn't just a man of the soil. He was a seer, a chronicler of vanishing England, writing in defiance of a world turning into fence and factory. The Enclosure Acts broke open the land, but Clare wrote it whole again. His poems preserved dialects, customs, names of plants and birds now lost to many tongues. His language of the hedgerow became a hidden archive, a folk record of things that empire had no time for. He was in many ways the first ecological poet, mourning loss while celebrating every still living root. Modern readers have begun to understand him anew. He is now seen not only as a poet of nature, but a writer of profound psychological insight. His struggles with identity, delusion, and mental illness make his work eerily contemporary, a 19th century voice echoing through 21st century understanding. Clare walks beside us still, in climate debates, in rewilding projects, in the call to honour landscape and memory. His larks still rise on the lines of nature writers and folk singers. His I am has become a whispered mantra for the unheard. He began as a barefoot boy, chasing thrushes through sunlit fields. He ended as a man in a room, listening to the wind beyond the windows. But in between, he wrote a map of a world now mostly gone, and somehow still waiting to be found. John Clare never stopped walking. Even now his words move ahead of us, down an old path, past the hawthorn, into a quiet clearing where no fence stands, and the sky is full of birdsong. John Clare's poetry moves my soul. It takes me where I long to be, right in the heart of nature. When I read his poems, I am there, and for that precious gift, I made this film. I saw you in my dreaming, where the paths have no name, and you are slightly smiling, but your face I can't remember. Where the path ends, the Skylarks take flight. Where the river bends, the dream ends in light. I'll see you again in the light. I'll see you again in the light of the sun of memory. I've seen you in the daylight, a face in the clouds, the unspoiled paradise in the mind's blue eye. Where the path ends, the Skylarks take flight. Where the river bends, the dream ends in light. Where the path ends, the Skylarks take flight. Where the river bends, the dream ends in light. I'll see you again in the light. I'll see you